Okay, so if you look at these two colours, hands up if you prefer the blue, and hands up if you prefer the dark yellowy green. So that's a hugely typical response. So the majority of people, there are a few, and perhaps more so than usual, majority of people prefer this blue, and only a few are preferring this dark yellowy green. And this preference for blue has been found in decades of research. So even in 1897, when Jastrow asked people to vote for their favourite colour at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, blue came out as the most liked colour. Decades of research has followed since, and we now know that colour preferences are both systematic and reliable. So here's some data from Steve Palmer and Karen Schloss, where they asked people to rate their preference for a simple patch of colour using a rating scale. And here's what we call a preference curve with colour preference on the y-axis for a set of hues: red, orange, yellow, chartreuse, green, cyan, blue and purple, and saturated, light, muted and dark versions of those hues. And what you can see is that people really dislike this dark yellow colour, similar to the colour you've just seen, and on average people like this saturated blue. This reliable and systematic nature of colour preference has led people to ask questions about where it comes from. So there's a nice quote from Zions where he says, well, what is it about colour that actually holds affect? Why do we like or dislike simple patches of colour? Other people have asked questions along the lines of nature-nurture. So, for example, Adams asks, well, are our visual systems just biased towards selecting or attending to certain parts of the spectrum? Is there something inherent about that part of the spectrum that makes it liked? Or are preferences culturally or experientially based? There have been two really high-profile theories of colour preference that have come out recently. So one is that colour preferences can be summarised by the biological components that underlie our early colour vision. So this was proposed by Anya Hurlbut and Yazoo Ling in Current Biology. And here we've got some data which just illustrates their theory. So we've got some preference data for Chinese males and females, and they were given these hues in pairs, and they were asked to pick the colour that they preferred. And you can see the resulting hue preference curves for the females and the males. Now here's how those same stimuli vary in S cone contrast between the stimulus and the background. In other words, the blue-yellow cone contrast. And they did similar things for LM, red-green cone contrast as well. But what you can see here is a striking similarity between how the stimuli vary in yellow-blue cone contrast and the preference curves for the Chinese males. So it almost looks as if Chinese male colour preference just is S-cone contrast between stimulus and background for this set of hues. Another influential theory is ecological valence theory by Karen Schloss and Steve Palmer. So they argue that we like colours to the extent that we like or dislike the objects that we associate with them. So, for example, we like this blue because it's associated with clear sky and clean water, and that's advantageous for our survival. We dislike this yucky yellowy green colour because it's associated with things like mould and biological waste products such as snot or pus or rust or feces. In this talk, I'm going to present a series of studies where we've aimed to test both of those theories, but also ask additional questions about the nature of our colour preferences when simple colour patches are shown and people are asked how much they like them. So first of all, I'll present a study where we look at infants' preferential looking to colours. So do infants look longer at colours that adults prefer? If so, then that would suggest that there is perhaps something inherent about certain parts of the spectrum that make them liked in adulthood. We also further investigate ecological valence theory, and we look at whether it can account for sex differences and cultural differences in colour preference. In the study where we look at cultural differences in colour preference, we measure colour preferences in a group of people called the Himba, who are from northern Namibia. So they're a semi-nomadic tribe or group of people. It's a nicer word. And they live in a non-industrialised culture. So before this study, colour preferences had only ever been tested in industrialised cultures where the kinds of artefacts that you see are perhaps quite similar. But the Himba live in a very natural, chromatic environment. So what are their colour preferences? And is there any evidence for claims in the literature that there are universal preferences for some colours such as blue? We also present a study where we look at colour preference in dichromacy, both to further test the cone contrast model of colour preference, but also with the aim of further understanding the perceptual experience of people who are lacking a cone type. And then finally, I'll present a study where we've investigated the neural basis of colour preference using fMRI. So in all of this research, we aim to further our understanding of colour preference, but we also aim to address broader issues in colour science, for example, how our colour perception develops, how our colour perception relates to objects, how we vary in our perception or our experience of colour, the effect of dichromacy or colour vision deficiencies, and the neural basis of how we process colour in the brain. Okay, so the literature on colour preference is just peppered with the ideas that colour preference is innate. So for example, back in 1931, Walton argued that there's just such sufficient agreement upon colour preference that there must be a basic or biological cause. Others have argued for a natural universal preference for some colours such as blue. And Palmer and Schloss in their original writings considered whether there could be genetically based colour preference or innate learning mechanisms that favour evolutionary advantageous colours over ones that aren't so good for our survival. Now, one way of testing this idea that there might be something innate about colour preference is to look at infants. So there have now been a number of studies looking at colour preferences in infants using a technique called preferential looking. So it's a very simple technique, but it's actually provided the bedrock of infant science for the last 60 or so years. Basically what you do is you show infant stimuli to the left and right of fixation, and you simply record how long they look at those stimuli. So you might be sceptical about whether you can get reliable measures from infants. So I've got a clip here to show you an infant being tested. So this infant is being shown a colour to the left and the right, and we're recording its looking time. So on that trial, it just wasn't interested. You can get that quite a lot with infants. And on this trial here, you can see it gives a quick look to one side. And a really strong look to the other side. So it's really easy to record infants' looking times, and all of the data is double-coded by separate coders, so you can check it's reliable. You can also use eye trackers, which measure without any form of human judgment at all. So we were interested in a study conducted in collaboration with Karen and Steve. To what extent do infants' looking biases at colour mirror those of adults' affective response to colour? And to do that, we chose a set of stimuli that were intended to capture this hue preference curve that was revealed in the American adults. So you can see that we've got light and dark versions of red, yellow, green and blue hues. And this dark yellow here is the colour that adults strongly dislike, and the blue is a hue that they like. And each colour was paired with every other colour, and we just recorded how long infants look at those colours using an eye tracker. We also tested adults, and the adults we also recorded their looking times, but simply told them that they were just a control for an infant study, so just to sit and look at the colours. We also had groups of adults rating their preference with more traditional measures, so choosing which colour they preferred and rating the preference on a scale. We found a remarkable similarity between adults' looking and preference ratings. So basically, adults will look longer at colours that they like. If you look at the preference curves here, what you've got on the y-axis is the probability of looking. So it's the time that they spend looking at a given colour as a function of their total time spent looking at all of the colours. So 0.125 is chance, because there's 8 colours. And what we find for adults, you can see here they're looking significantly less at dark yellow than chance, significantly more at the light blue than chance that's expected. And for these light and dark curve, it's mirroring what Palmer and Schloss found. Here's data for our 4 to 6 month old infants, and you can see a very different pattern of looking. They're significantly biased to looking longer at light red and less at light blue than is expected by chance. So from this we thought, well, okay, so there's no similarity between how long infants look at a colour and how much adults like that colour. However, these stimuli are relatively desaturated, and it's known that at lower saturation levels, infants can struggle with their Triton discrimination. So they're trichromatic at this age, but still some types of discrimination can be hard at lower levels of saturation. So it might be that this is accounting for the difference between the infants and the adults. We've got some data which potentially suggests that's the case. So this is a study which had 2 aims. One aim was to understand how infants categorise colour, and the other was to clarify the relationship between infant looking and adult preference when the colours are maximally saturated. So the stimuli we had were taken from the World Colour Survey naming grid, so they're maximally saturated versions of these hues here. And to test colour categories, we had a task which involved familiarising infants to a colour and then popping in a new colour later on in the experiment and seeing whether they actually recognise that change in colour. So do they show a preference for the novelty? I'm not going to talk about the category results. I'm happy to chat with people at the end about that if they're interested. But we can also use the data to look at colour preference. So Alice Skelton, who ran this study as part of her doctoral research, looked at how long infants looked on the first trial of the experiment. So 2 colours are shown and we just record looking, and different infants are seeing different colours. We also got adults to rate their preference for those same colours. And you see the data here, so infant looking time on the X and adult preference on the Y. And you can see a relationship between the two that accounts for almost half of the variance. So this dark yellow here is looked at by infants for only around about 2 seconds, and it's a colour which adults don't like. Whereas this blue up here is looked at for almost twice the amount, and it's a colour which adults highly like. So there's some evidence here that when you have colours that are maximally saturated, infants do actually look longer at colours that adults like, or there's a general pattern. There have been a number of studies that have attempted to explain why infants look longer at some colours than others. So a really neat set of experiments by Davida Teller, where she does psychophysical experiments to identify what colorimetric dimensions it is that relates to the infant's preferences. So here you can see some data where she's varied the colorimetric purity of the colour, and she's plotted it against preference for a number of hues. And you can see that if you keep purity constant, then the preferences across hues remain. She's done similar experiments to show that infants' looking biases aren't due to adult brightness or adult saturation, and that only 1/3 of the variance can be explained by infants' detection thresholds. And her conclusion is that infants look longer at some colours because they have a genuine hue preference. It's something about hue. We conducted a study in collaboration with Anya Hulbert and Yazoo Ling, where we looked at whether the cone contrast model of colour preference could account for infants' looking biases. So what we did was we took a sample of hues that were very similar to Anya and Yazoo's, and we paired them against each other, recorded looking time, the same as the prior study. And you can see this is infants' looking curves, so they're looking significantly longer at the reddish hues than chance and significantly less at the greenish hues. And around about 1/2 of the variance could be summarised using the difference in cone contrast between the stimulus and background, using the formulae that Anya and Yazoo used in their original paper. There's a stronger reliance on LM than S in the infant data here. In a very similar way, Brown and Lindsay have shown that colour preference data from infants can be modelled with the MacLeod-Boynton sensory model of colour vision. So here they're modelling some prior data from Mark Bornstein, where he recorded looking times in infants to monochromatic lights. And here they're modelling another one of our studies where we recorded infant looking times to the focal colours, the best examples of different colour categories. So what does this mean for theories on colour preference? The first point to make clear is that we're not talking necessarily about an effective response in infants. So just because infants look longer at a colour doesn't necessarily mean that they actually like it. So for example, infants will look longer at this fearful face than this happy face, and you wouldn't argue that they actually like fearful faces. It could be due to reasons such as the complexity or the novelty of the stimulus that also drive their response. So infants' preferential looking is best seen as a sensory bias, and we've shown that it can be summarised in terms of the fundamental neural processes that underlie our colour coding. With that in mind, there's some evidence that infants' early sensory response to colour can relate to adults' affective colour preference. And the challenge is to come up with a measure that will actually measure infants' affective response to see the similarity there. So we talked earlier about ecological valence theory, so this idea that we like colours to the extent that we like or dislike objects that are associated with them. In Palmer and Schloss's original study, they have separate groups of adults do different tasks. So one task is where participants are asked to rate how much they like a given colour using a rating scale. Another task is to list all the objects associated with that colour. Another is to rate how well all of those listed objects match the colour. And then finally, how much do you like the object that was associated with those colours? And they came up with a formula which results in something that they called a weighted effective valence estimate, or a WAVE. And in a nutshell, it represents how much, on average, you like the objects that are associated with a colour or dislike the objects. And they found a remarkable amount of similarity between the waves for colours and the colour preference curve. So 80% of the variance was shared. So you can see that the wave corresponds pretty neatly to the pattern of colour preference. People, on average, are associating this dark yellow with disliked objects and this blue up here with liked objects. A series of studies by a now completed Ph.D. student, Chloe Taylor, investigated further this idea of ecological valence. And Chloe wanted to see whether the theory could account for gender and cultural differences in colour preference, and also to try and understand further the mechanism of these relationships between object valence and preference. Okay, so this is a study where she looked at sex difference in colour preference, and you've got data for British males and females, with a set of colours similar to Palmer and Schloss's, so you've got saturated, light and dark versions of 8 hues. You can see that there are some noticeable sex differences. So males, for example, are preferring this saturated orange more than the females do, and the females are disliking the dark orange and the yellow more than the males. The question is, can the valence of male and female object associations account for those differences? So participants were asked, as in the original study, to associate objects with the colours and rate how much they liked them. And this gives you a snapshot of just some of the associations. So blue up here is associated with things that are liked, such as water, sea, sky and denim, whereas this dark yellow is associated with horrible things, also some positive things as well. Here are the waves for the males and the females. And you can see that the British male wave does a pretty good job of sort of mirroring this colour preference curve, with the peak in the orange being in the object associations as well. However, the female wave does a less good job, so this dislike of the dark orange and yellow isn't there for the females. And this figure summarises the relationships between the different measures. So you can see that the male wave is sharing about 74% of the variance with male preference, so almost as much as the original study. However, the female wave is only accounting for around half of the variance, so it's doing less well. One possible theory which we discussed with Steve and Karen is that perhaps female colour preferences is based more on symbolic associations. So here we're looking at associations with concrete objects, but the measure doesn't take into account other types of associations such as peace or love or harmony or other more abstract concepts. And symbolic associations is going to come up in the next talk. We also revealed another relationship between objects and colour preference that wasn't documented in Palmer and Schloss's original study. So in this relationship that we found here was between the number of objects that people associated with a colour and the preference. And this relationship was negative and explained 58% of the variance. So you can see that for the strongly disliked colour, people are associating a huge amount of objects with it, whereas for the blue hues, which are liked, they're eliciting much, much fewer object associations. So why is it that we like colours that are associated with with few objects, and dislike colours associated with lots of objects? Well, we can only speculate at this stage why that might be. So one potential theory was that this relationship relates to something called the negativity bias. So when you're given a stimulus that you're negative about, it's known that you actually produce a much richer vocabulary when talking about that stimulus. So it's possible that when you give people a colour and ask them to associate things with it, that elicits a richer list of associations than if you dislike it than if you like it. That, of course, would suggest that the causal relationship is going in the opposite direction, that the preference for the colour is affecting the object associations. Another theory is that it relates to the fluency hypothesis of aesthetics. So this is the idea that you like stimuli that are easy to process, and perhaps colours that have got fewer associations have just got a stronger identity and are more easily cognitively processed as a result. Of course, it could relate to the rarity. So as Bevel Conway said yesterday, there are very few objects that are cool, and it might be the rarity of those objects in that colour that lead to the preference. In another study, we looked at colour preferences in the Himba, who, as I said, are a semi-nomadic group of people from northern Namibia. So they live up here, right up in the corner of Namibia, up by Angola, in a region called the Kakaveld. And the Himba live a very rural existence. It's a non-industrialised culture. So the colours that they see are the colours of nature. So they don't have all the artificially coloured artefacts in their culture that we have. And you can see the kinds of colours that they see in their everyday life from these images here. Question is, can ecological valence theory account for any difference in preference between the Himba and cultures that have been tested previously? And is there any evidence for universal preferences for some colours such as blue? So here are the preference data for the Himba and the British participants. Now, the Himba are very unfamiliar with rating scales. It's not something that they have in their culture. And so what we came up with was a rating task where they used sticks. So they were given 10 sticks and asked if they liked something to give us lots of sticks, and if they disliked something to give us very few. And we tested that they understood this scale by asking them, how much do you like a scorpion? Now, scorpions, for obvious reasons, are disliked in the Himba culture. They gave us very few sticks. How much do you like cows and goats and animals which are good in their culture? And they gave us loads of sticks. Also, their effective response during the testing clearly showed us that they understood the scales. So when we showed them colours where they gave us lots of sticks, they clapped and sang and danced, and there was obvious glee at seeing these colours. So here are the Himba preference curves, and what you see is that they really like the saturated versions of red, orange, yellow, green hues. So the kinds of colours that colour the objects in their natural environment. They don't have a preference for cooler hues, and there's a flat preference curve for the light and dark versions of the hues. So it's saturation in warm hues that they're actually liking. Now this is obviously radically different to the so-called universal preference curves that we see in the British participants here. Can the Himba object associations and their valences account for this cultural difference? So obviously they have different objects in their environment and may have different emotional reactions to objects. Can that account for this difference? So we asked the Himba to associate objects with the colours that they saw, and also asked them to rate how much they liked those objects. And here's just a snapshot of some of the associations. So you can see that the dark purple was associated with things that are bad in their culture, such as tick blood and wild onion, because that's a poisonous plant, but also good things, so sky. So there's the most amazing sunsets in Kärkeveld region that do actually have this kind of dark purplish hue. Other associations for this dark yellow, it was associated with good things such as cows, soil and grass. Now we actually found no relationship between the wave and Himba female colour preference, and there was a relationship for the males, but it only accounted for about a quarter of the variance. If you summed the object valence rather than using the wave formula, which divides it by the number of objects, then there was a stronger relationship that accounted for almost half of the variance. So you can see that relationship by comparing the curves. It's actually a negative one. So the Himba males are liking these saturated hues here, but they're actually associated with disliked objects. So these hues have got a negative object valence. So why is it that Himba males would like colours that they associate with disliked objects? One possible theory is that it's due to arousal. So the objects that they're associating with the colour are somehow arousing, and that the Himba males are responding to that arousal in a similar way to the fact that some people like scary movies because they like being aroused, even, I hate them, even though it's a pleasant stimulus. Okay, so this clearly is in the opposite direction to which ecological valence theory predicts, but there is some relationship there nevertheless. This just summarises the strength of the relationships, and you can see the wave is doing a fairly good job of summarising British colour preference, a not so good job of summarising Himba colour preference, but at least the British wave has got nothing to do with Himba preference and vice versa. What actually was the strongest predictor of whether the Himba liked a colour or not was chroma, so colourfulness. So you can see that they're liking the saturated hues here, but colourfulness can't account for all of their pattern of response because they're also disliking the cooler hues. But this reliance on chroma is the strongest that's in the literature. And what it suggests is that not only is there not universal preferences for certain hues, but there's not even a universal way of ordering our colour preference. It's not always on the basis of hue that we're making our judgments of whether we like or dislike certain colours. There have been a number of really neat studies further investigating ecological valence theory. One study looking at Japanese colour preference, and again it couldn't account for much of the variance in preference. And some really neat studies by Karen Schloss and colleagues where they test specific predictions of the theory. So for example, they show that personal affiliations can affect your colour preference. that the waves can account for individual difference in colour preference, and there's some evidence for the causal relationship between the valence of objects and the preferences. For example, in a study where participants were primed with liked or disliked objects, and the colour preferences changed as a result. We saw there how there are sex differences in colour preference. This is a topic that's discussed a lot, both in science and in general life. There have been various theories that have attempted to account for sex differences. Hurlbut and Ling, in their original study, argued that females might weight the LM cone contrast between stimulus and background more positively, so they have a bias towards reddish hues compared to males. A study by Sorokowska and Witzel looked at preference in Polish and Yali, so another non-industrialized culture, and found that actually a simple red-blue contrast based on the similarity of red and blue could account for the sex differences in both of those cultures and worked better than red-green cone contrast. However, we find no reliable sex differences in our Himba adults, and we also find no evidence of sex differences in infant looking times in any of the studies. In fact, there's a nice study by Vanessa LeBeau which suggests that sex differences in colour preference actually come online around about the time that people develop sex stereotyped behaviours. So once a little girl starts realising she's a little girl and doing sex stereotype behaviour, then the preference for pink starts to kick in, unfortunately. Okay, so in another study we've also considered individual difference in colour preference, but this time looking at differences on the basis of the underlying colour vision. And this is a study run by Leticia Alvaro. So she did her Ph.D. in the University of Complutense in Madrid, and her Ph.D. was looking at the effect of dichromacy, so lacking a cone type, on colour naming. And she did an internship in my lab, and we wondered, well, if colour naming differs, how does colour preference differ, and are there any similarities? Looking at colour preference in dichromats also, of course, provides another test of the model that colour preference is somehow related to cone contrast. So she had a test battery which included the Ishihara, the City, the Lantini Triton album, and they also did a Rayleigh match on the anomaliscope. And she had 15 protonopes who are lacking the L cone and 17 deuteronopes who are lacking the M cone. And they did 2 behavioural tasks, so really simple study. They're given a colour patch and they're asked to rate their colour preference on a sliding scale, and they're also asked to name the colour. And for colour naming, the response time was recorded. And the colours that she showed them are up here, so saturated, light and dark versions of 8 hues, and also the best examples of the basic colour terms. Here you can see the preference curves for trichromat males and females, that's the top row, and dichromat protonope and deuteronopes. And not surprisingly, you can see some differences in preference. So, excuse me, most noticeably, the protonopes and deuteronopes have got this peak in preference for yellow, which is lacking in the trichromat curve. The protonopes are more dissimilar to the trichromats than the deuteronopes are, so the protonopes actually dislike the blue hues, whereas that effect is muted for the deuteronopes. Now, Leticia looked at whether cone contrast between stimulus and background could summarise the preference curves in the same way that Hurlbut and Ling did in their original study. And what she found was that the trichromat preference curves were pretty well captured by cone contrast if you only looked at colours within one set. So if you had a set of colours that primarily varied in hue, the relationship between the preference curve and cone contrast was remarkably good. Leticia did some further analyses where she looked at whether a cone contrast model that took into account the altered cone response in dichromacy could account for the dichromat's preference curve. And what actually came out was that an absolute measure of the yellow-blue cone contrast, so ignoring the sign, could account for dichromat preference for some of the sets. She also found evidence of a residual LM mechanism for the deuteranopes for some sets, and the stimuli were 8 degrees, and it's known in the colour naming literature that when stimuli are above 3 degrees, that you can get similar effects, similar contributions to the colour naming, and there's various theories for why that might be. She also looked at the relationship between colour preference and colour naming. So here what you can see is the naming response time. So it was measured with voice recognition software and measured the time at which people gave their response for what the colour was called. And it's plotted against colour preference for male and female trichromats and deuteranopes and protonopes. And what she found was a relationship between the two measures for the male trichromats and for the protonopes and the deuteranopes. This relationship is basically that colours that can be named quickly are liked more. She also found the similar relationship between how consistently the colours were named over multiple presentations and how much they were liked. Now, the important thing here is that the colours that are named quickly are different for the dichromats than the trichromats. So you've got two tests here of this relationship, different colours in both. And you also note that the protonopes and deuteranopes are obviously slower at naming. However, this relationship between naming and preference was lacking for the females. And in all of the studies of colour preference that we've done, female colour preference just seems much more elusive. It's harder to pin down, it's harder to find measures that actually relate to it. Now, one possibility is that this relates to the fluency hypothesis that I've already talked about of aesthetics, that we like stimuli that are simple to process. So stimuli that we can recognise and name quickly are more fluently processed, and therefore we prefer them. That's one potential account. The final study I'm going to outline was conducted by Chris Racy, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the Sussex Colour Group, in collaboration with Chris Bird, who's an fMRI expert at Sussex. What we wanted to look at was where in the brain does the activation correlate with people's colour preferences. So we didn't want to image the region of the brain involved with making a judgment about colour. We know from other neuroaesthetic studies that certain regions of the brain, such as the orbitofrontal cortex, are involved when you're making a judgment of how much you like something. What we're asking here is, well, where in the brain do you find differences between liked and disliked colours? Where are the correlates of preference? So the main task was a passive viewing task where participants just viewed multiple colours and they weren't asked to make an explicit judgment about that colour in any way. They're just making a judgment about the orientation of the patch. So it could be one of 4 orientations and they say which one. And the orientation task is just to keep them engaged and looking throughout the task. We then had some localizer tasks, and we chose these because they localize regions that you might expect colour preference correlates to exist in. So, for example, we used a colour localizer based on Lehr, and Conway's work, where participants saw a chromatic grating that was moving or an achromatic grating to localize the regions of the brain involved in colour processing. We also had a colour naming localizer where participants actually actively named the colours that they saw, or they just repeated an inappropriate word. And an object recognition localizer where participants saw scrambled or intact objects, which was intending to localize the lateral occipital complex. So there's other object regions in the brain that might be implicated in colour preference. So, for example, the left fusiform gyrus is known from previous studies to be involved in colour object knowledge. And from the other localizer tasks that we've got, and just looking at the structure of the brain, we can look at correlates in that region as well. We also had some behavioural tasks, so no scanning was done during these tasks. Participants were asked to rate their colour preference using the sliding scale, and also, as the same as Leticia's study, to name the colour using basic colour terms, and the response time was recorded. Here are the behavioural preference curves, and so we're looking for regions of the brain that correlate with this measure. Here are our regions of interest. So we've localised regions of the brain involved in colour processing, involved in object recognition, and also involved in colour naming. I'm just going to present one analysis. So analysis of this study is ongoing. There's actually quite a few analyses we can do. We present one analysis today where we've done a whole brain analysis. So we're basically looking throughout the voxels in the brain for clusters of voxels that correlate with the behavioural measure of colour preference when participants are just passively viewing colour. And what this provides us with is significant activation in two regions, the left precuneus and the posterior cingulate cortex. Now we know that they're involved in general processes such as visual imagery, episodic memory, the default mode network, and you can kind of see how those might relate to preference. But there's also other studies which more specifically identify this region as relating to some kind of preference or emotional response. So for example, there's a study where people were asked to make value judgments. So how much would you pay for this? And that activates the posterior cingulate cortex. And there's other studies looking at music preference, aesthetic judgment of shape, and also the processing of basic emotions that also identify this region. So far what this suggests is that the neural basis of colour preference points to perhaps domain general mechanisms being at play when we're making judgments of how much we like a colour. So similar mechanisms to judgments of our preference for shape or music or other types of stimuli. And to a certain extent so far, theories of colour preference have been fairly insular, so they've been designed to account for preferences within the domain of colour. But this activation here might encourage us to look at similarities across domains in preference ratings as well. We've got further analyses that Chris is currently conducting where we aim to drill down into these regions of interest and see whether we get relationships of colour preference in those regions as well. Okay, so to summarise the main findings of the talk, first of all, we find that infants tend to look longer at colours that adults like when colours are maximally saturated. And you can summarise infants' pattern of looking by simple models of colour vision that take into account infants' sensory response to colour. We also find the ecological valence theory can account for colour preferences. We don't find as strong relationships as the original work and a weaker relationship for the females, and that deserves further investigation. We find that ecological valence theory, the predictions actually work in the opposite direction for our Himba males, who actually like objects that they associate with disliked things. And the Himba colour preference data challenges this notion that there are universal preferences for some colours over others. In fact, the Himba appear to base their affective response to colour on more on saturation than on hue. We also find that dichromat preference curves are perhaps not surprisingly dissimilar, but that they peak in yellow and can be accounted for by the absolute difference in yellow-blue cone contrast. And this perhaps enriches our understanding of the perceptual experience of people with dichromacy. We also find a negative relationship between how quickly the colour is named and how much it's liked. So essentially, we like colours that can be quickly named. And then finally, the fMRI study, where the analysis is ongoing, has so far revealed two regions of the brain that are involved in domain general processing of preference of stimuli from across domains. So what does all of this mean? What does it mean for that question that we posed at the beginning of the talk? Well, what is it about colour that holds affect? Well, we all know that colour is actually many things. It's multifaceted. So colour is a basic sensory response. It's also a property of objects in the environment. It's something we talk about, something we use to communicate. It's something that we think about, we use in our memory. And I've not talked about this much today, but it's something that has socio-cultural meaning. It's something that's used for symbolism or signalling things. And throughout our studies, we show that there's a relationship between these processes and when people are given a simple patch of colour, how much they like that colour. And the challenge for further research now is to actually come up with a theory of colour preference that can take into account all of these relationships and clarify the nature of those relationships and whether they interact. Okay, so finally, I'd just like to acknowledge my collaborators, both within the Sussex Colour Group and also at other universities, and also just to thank our funders. Thanks very much. So, as a psychologist, my main goal is to understand people's response to visual stimuli. So my goal here isn't an applied goal to be able to predict how people prefer colours in dynamic situations such as in film or art. That requires a much more complex approach. So what we're asking here is just simply humans' response to their effective response to a simple patch of colour when it's devoid of context. Now you may say, well, if there's no application of this research or if it requires much more research to actually apply it, then what's the point? Well, the point is it's addressing fundamental questions in cognitive science, scientific questions about individual differences in our response to colour, how our colour perception relates to underlying components of colour vision. So yeah, I would say that that's not the goal, but that goal is very valid and should be something that is considered in other research. Yeah, there certainly is an influence of culture, or in your case, peer pressure on colour preference. But you can get colour preferences in fairly young toddlers. You can ask them what their emotional response to colour is. And we can measure them systematically and reliably. So they're not, you've seen throughout the talk, they're not just a social construct. They do relate to the underlying components of colour vision. But certainly there's an element of peer pressure, and you see that in Vanessa Lebue's work that I talked about, where the preference in little girls for pink starts around the time that they have sex stereotype behaviours, and they feel as if they have to act and identify like a girl. So certainly that at play, but it can't account for all of the findings on colour preference. Yeah, the context definitely affects people's colour preferences. We know that from Karen Schloss's work, where she looked at colour preferences for colours when they're on t-shirts or cars or walls, and the preference curves change, and Karen can tell you more about that. But what we're looking at here, because we don't have an applied goal, is preference for simple patches of colour that are devoid of context. And certainly looking at how that changes with context is a worthwhile endeavour, but much more complicated. Your question is tapping to an important issue. So how is it that we actually measure people's true colour preferences devoid of the social influence of the answer of what you may give? You might argue that, well, the fMRI study, which finds correlates of preference in certain regions of the brain, does that to a certain extent. But yeah, you could think up of other tasks, perhaps using like implicit association, that might get at colour preferences when you're not actually making an explicit judgment. And it would be nice to see the similarity between those implicit biases and the explicit preference ratings. It's a good question, thank you.